But we would like to start by reporting to the federal president, who is going to give us his statement. Professor Ruppert.
Eine wichtige Lektion, die wir alle aus dieser falschen Pandemie lernen sollten, ist ein adäquates Verständnis von Gesundheit und Krankheit. Der Staat kann niemand dazu zwingen, erwachsen zu handeln und gut und gesund zu leben. Er kann nur die Rahmenbedingungen schaffen, die dem größtmöglichen Allgemeinwohl dienen. Sie wollen nicht als die Täter, die sie in Wahrheit sind, gesehen werden, sondern als Wohltäter. Dieses Muster finden wir im Grunde bei allen kriegerischen Auseinandersetzungen in der Menschheitsgeschichte. Erinnern wir uns, auch in der Corona-Pandemie, dass solche Worte verwendet werden. Wir sind im Krieg. Wir müssen die Schlacht gegen die Viren gewinnen. Es sind die Urängste unseres menschlichen Daseins. Ein Kampf gegen Viren ist in Wahrheit aber ein Kampf gegen die Menschheit, welche diese Viren in sich tragen oder vermeintlich um sich herum verbreiten können. Sie können daher niemals durch Kampf und Krieg, sondern nur durch bedingungslose Selbstliebe geheilt werden. Jeder kann das in seinem Alltag prüfen. Handle ich aus meiner Angst heraus oder aus meiner Selbstliebe?
And I would like to refer back to The Black Death by Albert Camus. The most important thing in combating a disease is to know about it. So if we don't know about it, then we can't make any progress.
But vaccination, as they have no basis, at least they are not causing harm, because that's the only question that needs to be clarified.
I have to admit that even as a member of parliament at the time, who was involved very deeply in this topic, I hardly noticed what was happening there. I'm talking about the Medication Act. It was modified to include the insertion of nucleic acids, part of the definition of a vaccination, except that nobody dared do it because the resistance against these genetic modifications in the population was very large. Let me just remind you of the fact that the Green Party were always at the forefront of rejecting the release of genetically modified organisms, for instance. This mRNA technology leads to the to the production of these spike proteins, and that was now licensed as an emergency allowance in the EU. Is it possible for these viruses to modify in the body again so that they can spread, including the information for the formation of spike proteins? That would be a self-propagating vaccination. How has it been ruled out that this can happen? Let me remind you that when the poliomyelitis vaccination was instituted, the swallow vaccination led to a situation where these viruses, they can remodify and then spread again. So whether this can happen again with these viruses now, with these modified viruses we have now, that in passing through people, they can modify back to becoming pathogenic, that is something I don't know, but we will have to find out what the risk is, how high this risk is, and we would have to take that into consideration in dealing with these vaccinations and in handling the people. We've seen again and again that the pharmaceutical industry suppresses data that they're not happy with. We've seen that with numerous medications, that there was selective publication going on, and that the results that were positive were published twice as frequently as the results that were not so positive. Then this leads to a violent inflammation reaction, destroying the tissue, the surrounding tissue. And if that happens in the ovaries, that can lead to severe damage to the ovaries, resulting in infertility. And the interesting thing is that there were no animal testing that allows them to notice and that communicates to the cells that something is happening, that something needs to be done. Specialists need to be called in, just like the fire brigade or the police are being called in, just like in a city, you call different squads for a bank robbery than for others. So if the fire is out, then the fire brigade doesn't need to keep coming, but you have to and clog the road. But instead, you have to tell the fire brigade, okay, the fire is gone, and you need this sort of feedback. And this mechanism, this braking mechanism, is really important, because if that doesn't happen, you get a mad alarm, and the entire body is alarmed, and then this can lead to organ failure. That's the cytokine storm that you hear so much about. So it's complete communication failure at cellular level. Maybe the body may not immediately respond like that, but maybe when something similar happens, that this major conflagration starts then, and the fire brigade may then start to pour petrol on the fire instead of water. Some immunologists believe that this may happen. Some say that it will definitely happen. I cannot really tell you. But what is certain is that as a government, we have to prepare for something happen there. So we need a new preparedness, vaccination damage and preparedness. We have to think about how to deal with it if the worst case happens. So we need the necessary options to help them, and we do need to do research here.
And the
definition was changed by the WHO now, saying that herd immunity can only be achieved by vaccination. And that would mean that everything the body can do, which is much stronger and much more perfect than any industrial product could be, this is pushed out and forgotten and replaced by new and maybe hazardous new technologies. Of course, they want to vaccinate us against everything and forget that we do not really need it.
A large part of the population has already been in contact with this new corona disease, and this, together cross immunity and T cells, leads to herd immunity. Suddenly this is modified anyway, and this natural immunity is no longer accepted. Only the vaccination-born immunity is accepted, and that is something that I, as a non-physician, but as a layperson, perceive this as an absurd redefinition, again by the WHO, where I kind of wonder, how can they assume sovereignty over us in Germany and other countries in the world with this grotesque approach? So
immunity cannot be defined by law. That is nonsense. It's much too complex for that. But the respiratory illnesses are something different. These are contacts with certain viruses that use certain biological gaps and which are completely different. And this is completely different than the standard measles vaccinations. So it's very, very complex systems on how our bodies deal with microorganisms and coexist with them. And so do we have, as Mike Keaton said it, compared to looking at the virus, which is out there, which doesn't seem to be more dangerous than anything we know. Do we have herd immunity?
Yes.
And okay, good.
In excess of 90% of the residual activity.
Okay, that's a clear statement. There is no more questions to this.
Under the chapter Missing Information, important facts are shown. For instance, that the mid- and long-term effects of these substances are unclear, that nothing is known about the impact on pregnancies or breastfeeding mothers.
We have to conclude, at least I do so, that the 𝗔𝗔 themselves, based on the provided documentation by the manufacturers, they can't say whether it is effective and whether it has side effects or not. Maybe it may, that's the hope, be effective against severe courses. That's right, okay, and that corresponds to the contracts that we have here at the moment between the individual states and BioNTech Pfizer. I expect the others' contracts to include the same contracts, and these contracts explicitly say that the producer is not liable for anything, and they are freed from any liabilities by the patients, and they are protected against this liability by the national governments, and that means the taxpayers will pay for the damages, and there can't be any statement whether the substance is effective or whether it is hazardous. These contracts have been kept closed so far. They have been disclosed by whistleblowers. That seems to correlate with the documentation presented to the EMA. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. These are advance purchase agreements.
It's a question whether the people who are responsible for this can protect themselves. For me, it's absolutely impossible. They will all be liable.
We have had a few analyses compiled, but you can see from the US database VAERS that tracks the numbers of deaths related to vaccination. So from 1992 to 2020, it was a very low rate, a very low bottom, maybe 100 people per year or something like that. And now it seems it exploded since the application of the Corona vaccination. It went way up to this nearly 10,000 people. And we have to expect that it is actually a lot more because, as we know, these databases usually only collect 1 to 10% of all cases. We can't see right now, and this is obvious. That was publicized in January. The injection means that the spike proteins get into the bloodstream, and of course they're highly toxic, leading to several collateral consequences in different organs. So the micro bloodstream, the smallest vessels, can be clotted. This can be shown, and we got reports from doctors. Some say 30%, others say 50%. Some say in excess of 70% of samples we got. The spikes lead to a decrease of thrombocytes, and this indicates that there is some coagulation somewhere in the body, and then of course we can measure these thrombosis. It's been discussed for AstraZeneca the whole time, but it also applies to all the others. The spikes are used by all vaccinations, so we have to see how many collateral cases per vaccination do you have, and that is exponentially higher than with other vaccinations. We have collateral damage with, or collateral effects, side effects with all other vaccinations, but we cannot explain away the large number with these vaccinations now, and it is obvious that particularly toxic reactions are created by these injections, which normally doesn't happen in an infection, and therefore this may make people ill and cause their death. I asked with one manufacturer, and they said yes, but the spikes are only generated in the muscles where the injection is given, and that is untrue. And 𝗏𝗺𝗃 company has shown with their distribution study from Japan, they knew it themselves that they are all over the body. We don't know exactly where. Well, I got feedback from gynecologists. They took a look at the lymph nodes in women. There are axillary lymph nodes near this place where the injection is made. They have a large number of swelling in the lymph nodes. So anyone who looks at this palpitating the lymph nodes, etc., that shows clearly that this happens. This is undisputed, that this mRNA doesn't stay where it is injected, but that it spreads around the body, and that leads to these toxic consequences and deaths.
And by now, the doctors, Dr. Charles Hoff from Canada and Dr. Reiner Fuellmich from Idaho in the US and others, we've heard that certain parts of the body cannot be repaired if they are damaged by the spike protein.
That includes the brain.
So that's heart, spine,
And above all, the heart muscle. And as we heard, that our vaccination committee said those were all small side effects. No, if the heart muscle is damaged, it is not repaired. The heart remains weakened for life.
Minister, is this correct? Right that the head of the 𝗚𝗎𝗆 worked for the pharma industry before she took on office?
Yes, I heard that as well. She worked with different pharma industry. She was with the WHO, so she went through the pharmaceutical industry till she went to 𝗚𝗎𝗆 now. So just before the pandemic, before the crisis, she was transferred there just in time, basically, to wave this through.
So this can't be seen as a coincidence. As a chancellor, I would think that we have to get to a point that will probably force us to split off the supranational organizations. This has improved a little, and we've seen that the chair of the 𝗕𝗃𝗀𝗁 has presented their opinion again and again and was very refraining against vaccinating children, but we have a stronger effect of politics here, and that is much more difficult for the members. In the economy, they can say, in business, they can say, we don't want this. But as this is appointed by the ministry, it's difficult for the members who are appointed for a certain term only to contradict the politics. And the minister has a great responsibility here in staffing the committee.
Well, then we should give the political guidelines of the new government.
My proposal would be not to appoint these people by politicians like the National Ethical Commission. It's people who are only on approval of the government, who only say what the government wants to hear. And of course, they are scrutinized before. And what we need is the parliament to be as the body, and the opposition in the parliament would be most important here, that there are members who really say what needs to be said, because the opposition sent them there, so that conflicts are made transparent here and made visible. So the staffing of such bodies should be made by the parliament and responsible by the parliament. That would be an initial proposal off the cuff that I could make. Maybe the population could be involved in this, and not only the big associations, because there are interests here. So maybe it could be a coincidence, some criteria that should play a role. So we should come up with an independent method of staffing these committees, so that people can really speak freely, can contradict, and that all of that is documented, so that democratic decisions can be made that everybody who is concerned can understand. I think that's important.
Well, it will be important maybe to have those meetings live, or at least document them on film, because they're subject to corruption otherwise.
So what's on the ground in your area of competency? Care of elderly, what can be observed here? These were the so-called vulnerable groups, which, according to my layman's understanding, shouldn't have been vaccinated at all because they are vulnerable. What happened after the vaccination? Does that correspond to what we heard from the whistleblowers, what we saw in our earlier work in the Corona Committee, 20% of deaths? Does that correspond to what we hear?
Well, again, no data is collected here. We can only can rely on anecdotal evidence from the people who work on the ground. Some people have said that after the vaccinations, the dying started. We can't verify because there's no data collection.
But where does this kind of statement from? It doesn't come from the people who died, but from people who observed it. Who observed it? Was it the people in the elderly homes who report this?
That's individual staff members, usually those who are not vaccinated, who report this. It's surprising that infections started after the vaccinations, not only positive tests, but also symptoms kicked in. Then increase of dementia, which might be in the context of microthrombosis in the brain, affecting circulation, increasing forgetfulness and other dementia symptoms, then dizziness, blood pressure attacks, high blood pressure in people who never had a problem with that, then with all sorts of complications, collapse situations, many falls due to dizziness, but also visual impairment, fatigue, lack of motivation, and also poorer wound healing, not only with bed sores, but also with other wounds, such as bladder infections that you normally can control with antibiotic treatment that simply won't go away anymore, that sort of thing, that are observed by people who have been working in nursing for 30 years.
Not at this frequency. The big mortality is setting in. We've heard this from other places as well, that heavy adverse effects that have not been seen 30 years before.
Nursing and hospital staff, there are 65,000 staff members of nursing and health services. The fact is that anyone who can avoid being sent to a home tries to avoid it. In nursing, we have the situation where in Germany we've hardly any alternative. 1/3 of those who require nursing have to live in an institution today. There's always been a nursing crisis, but now this is reaching a point where people are nearly left to their own devices, unless something very fundamental happens now, because after the vaccinations there's a lack of personnel. The lack of personnel has become worse. 2/3 or 80% of nursing staff have been vaccinated, also because there is more, there's a higher sick leave rate, and many desert the profession. And if we have an increase of this crisis, then more people will leave the profession. And then who will look after patients if you have the staff ill or left? And if a doctor faces a patient and vaccinates him, he believes that he helps the patient develop immunity. Of course, he has to weigh it against the risks. Maybe he may be faced with a patient who must not be vaccinated, generally speaking, but that there should be such a drastic gulf between benefit and risk is something that hardly any doctor knows in Germany, I'd say. And that's the first psychological damage, because people see people as a herd of cattle that goes to a vaccination center and gets a vaccination. And this includes children. Now, that's a dramatic situation, because we need to prepare for a situation, particularly against the background of this information we got today, that soon enough we will get major problems. That's really simple to check. It's really very easy to do. If I observe the cases that come along with a positive test in hospitals or the practices, they may be patients who have been received vaccination or not, and I can see if they're ill or not, and I can count it. And if I find that the people who have been vaccinated are sicker than the people who haven't been vaccinated, if they're present, well, then it must be the vaccination. So after a certain number of such observations, I know that it comes from the vaccination. And this is not done because the doctors who administer the vaccinations, monitoring the patients, they would incriminate themselves because they administered the vaccination, and as also a vaccination center, they have no interest in these things coming to light. It's really disastrous how things are happening these days.
That's something that needs to be stopped immediately, yes. And if we look at the complications, so now we're getting to a period where we don't know what's coming up. The health minister has talked about the Ŵy'n storm, so we have to expect that banal or simple infections may lead to sepsis or things like this.
Based and after vaccination.
Maybe even after the influenza vaccination, maybe it could harm or unbalance the immune system in a way that we have consequences that have not been there before.
So you need another vaccination after the corona vaccination. It's a reaction to the corona
yes,
vaccination.
And if we have an economically feeble health system and a health system where doctors and nurses are vaccinated themselves, so to a large extent they may be absent. In Rostock said that the intensive care wards for the children are usually close to larger institutions, cannot work because of economic and staff restrictions, so they cannot have a shift operation. That's a disaster, really, especially against the background that we are asked to vaccinate children now. And I'd like to remind you that the first outward patients in the stations are coming in, and statements here are that children from 12 years on can be also vaccinated if the parents do not agree. I think the Ministry of Justice has to take a clear stand here as far as liability is concerned.
Labor Minister, I know that you had closures in an East German state where you have very long access distances for people going to a hospital, and that is something that we really have to consider. How long can people actually drive if they have a terminal constipation or they have a thrombosis or a stroke? If people have to go 100 kilometers to the nearest hospital, I mean, it's a time-crucial aspect.
Well, in 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, where we had the horrible predictions, many of the hospitals were closed, 27 of them, and step by step, 200 hospitals in Germany, yes. Who benefits if the health system and the health supply is reduced in Germany? Hospitals are closed, intensive care beds are shut down, and the staff, due to the pressure, the psychological pressure, and in their personal health, these people are put at hazard or even damaged. Who benefits from this? Surely not the population, because they have no health supply anymore. So who benefits here? Because it's less money that is spent, although the same money should come in. So who benefits? I think this is something that we need to investigate into.
Well, clearly, those who provide the money, the health insurance companies, we can clearly say that. It's not only in the context of closures, but also in the context of the Hospital Financing Act. The regulations are becoming ever more stricter, where staff don't get pay rises, etc. And when a hospital comes to a point where it can't work profitably anymore, then it has to be closed. And then, of course, we can see that it is one of the big employers in rural areas. We have to make sure that the data, which is really important data, data that doctors can collect, is collected in a relevant way. It doesn't have to be attaching names to it. Now this is done, what happens? Now the company's battlesmen know exactly who has what, who got what, who needs what. It's much more transparent for industry than for the public health service. We don't need personalized data. We need population data so we can see developments and trends, and this is completely underutilized today. So data is collected, but not by those and for those who actually are responsible for good health provision. Yes, that's another big issue that really worries me. I am preparing an analysis at the Paul-Ehrlich Institute to see how this is organized, how the side effects are collated, and we have to do that together with the states. And that's why I am going to hold a conference with the states' health ministers in order to see what are the side effects, what could be in those vaccines, what is in these vaccines, or are the companies running secret experiments with us, with the population, because there's no ethics commission that's involved here. We simply have vaccines in huge batches, and the companies know what's in these batches. Nobody else knows. And I asked Paul-Ehrlich before we were in government, and the answer was, well, we rely on the data provided by the producers, by the manufacturers. And what we now have is lack of transparency and inefficient monitoring. I want to know from the Paul-Ehrlich Institute whether they rely on the producers' indications when it comes to the ingredients of batches, or do they rely on laboratory testing by independent laboratories. With cancer medication, we only found out about mass cases of deaths with cytostatica. We only learned about that through whistleblowers. Cytostatica. So, where is the oversight for immunological vaccinations for SARS-CoV-2? When are analyses performed? Are all batches analyzed, or only random batches? How is it done? How often? Where? What are you looking for? If somebody says there are new toxins in this, what do you look for? What don't you look for? And then the question, where is the documentation of the results? Those are questions that the Paul-Ehrlich Institute has to answer now. And we have to ask these questions now. And we need to get these answers. Well, couldn't there be some consumer protection agencies that monitor this? Just like with the food industry, where they analyze sausages or whatever. Well, the question is absurd. The Paul-Ehrlich Institute is a consumer protection institute. Well, I have great concerns that the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, 𝗷𝗺𝗺𝗃 Institute, the Health Ministry, the vaccination manufacturer, what we're talking about is always central institutions. It's 𝗔𝗌, who may or may not publicize findings. From my point of view, it's always top-down. We always depend on whether there's a whistleblower. How can we always rely on whistleblowers? Well, we as a government cannot be left to wonder what we can tell the population what's in their vaccines. That's not acceptable. So we will issue the appropriate decrees, Mr. Kohn, to make sure that the institutions attached to your institute, such as the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, do the right thing. We can't accept a situation that some people in key positions simply block everything and analyze only in favor of industry. And that was why I asked the question. It's only a question of totaling up one and one. If we have to assume, and that's what we are assuming right now, that nobody but the manufacturers know what the vaccines contain, if we also have to assume, and we do assume this now, that the individual national governments, not only ours, but all the others as well, make secret agreements with exactly these vaccine manufacturers who say we don't know if it's effective, we don't know what the side effects are, and we reject all liability. And if we also see that large parts, which are the batches that cause this damage? Well, 10% of batches cause 75% of damages. Well, then the only conclusion can be that here, private industry, possibly because of public-private partnership, which of course focuses on those who have the money, i.e. the private partner, that this leads to a large-scale experiment. That's the only conclusion I have. Well, I had this suspicion before I was part of the government, that this emergency situation is, of course, ideal for all these big biotech and vaccination companies to try out things they never dared try before. And things that they cause themselves, that we found. They cause a problem that they solve themselves then. And we've heard of these self-replicating vaccines that pharmaceutical companies wanted to try out for a long time. We can't do that, though, testing it on people. But if somebody wants to try this because they want to have a lead over people, they just try it. They get the data from Google and company, from Bertelsmann and all that collect data through the apps. So they know which were a control group. That's the possibility. Nobody would notice now. I'm thinking in criminal terms now, but as a health minister, I owe this to the population to preclude this abuse. And people have to be able to rely on the fact that this is not possible. I couldn't guarantee it now because we don't have the data available. Because we don't collect the data, because nobody tells us. We don't even know who has the data. We don't know who performed which analyses with what results. Those are things that we have to clarify. How was that possible? Do we expect, that's my concrete suspicion, do we have to assume that the previous government had no respect of the interests of the population, but only of the interests of business? You can see that at WHO. The ambassadors to Geneva represent their countries there. Sometimes the health ministers convene there, and you can clearly see that for most countries, economic interests prevail. So the economic factor, health system is what's discussed there, and who should have access, who shouldn't. So it's about the economic competition between the various countries there, and that is how the entire health system is organized. The entire health system has become a health market. So the question is, how can we earn money with health coverage? And of course, the more disease there is around, the more money you can make. And if the governments get involved and engage in precautionary action, then they can destroy this business model.
I would like to comment one thing. We need another access to the reports that are coming into the archive. I think the batches are reported there, and or we have to make sure that this is the case, and that we can see where are there regional clusters of problems. Maybe that's in the cities. Where is these things? Where are the batches used? And maybe we even need to change the mandatory reporting. We need the data. Yeah, I have one question to Mr. Koch. And that's one thing, Mr. Kohn. I want to have the positive quota laboratory based. I want to know where are the clusters of positive results. Are there any? We don't have that. The suspicion is getting bigger and bigger, that here we are not facing incidental errors, but with organized criminality. The herd immunity that we are started with is starting to herd idiocy or organized crime. I think this is the finding that is emerging more and more clearly, because you, Ms. Frau von Stresser, you noted that we do not know how it emerges that the Paul-Ehrlich Institute loses deaths, so we have to look who has access to the raw data and who does changes to that database, and we have to clarify this to see where whatever kind of influence is taken. Are there concrete hints to this, that deaf people have been eliminated from the database and so they keep this. They have every single report and reported. We've got the reports, we looked at them, and we found apparently there is fewer deaths. Well, I'm asking, it could be the case that if the reported cases are available, that certain criteria, cost checks are made, so plausibility, and that may lead to some changes because some may not be plausible. Theoretically, that could be possible, but we have the same reports from the US that here in the statistics, the number of deaths is manipulated by older deaths coming in and new ones are putting in instead of adding them simply to the roll. That is a situation that we have to follow up on. After what we know by now, we cannot simply expect that this is some kind of coincidence or accidental mistakes. Of course, we have to check the flow of data, and the data flow has to be monitored and controlled. The question also is whether this fully digitalization of all databases is necessary. It is, of course, good beneficiary, but that some data for vaccinations or others that are person-related, that they may be left in regional, communal, municipal responsibilities even, or that one may check to have a central set of data which is analog, because this is data that can be understood later on. Everything else, once it's out of the flow, it's gone. Yes, a very good point, I think, so that if it's central, it's very easy to manipulate it, and that does not only apply to elections, applies to immunology as well. We have another problem which concerns me greatly in my area is, of course, the police, who have been largely vaccinated. Also here, we may have the problem that many officers may be absent, and this also applies to the teachers and the kindergarten teachers and so on. So maybe we are running into a vaccination population issue here, which affects many fundamental areas, essential areas of the population. So after what we've heard so far, we can't just sit and wait for things to happen. I think we seriously have to prepare for a difficult autumn with severe consequences. Vaccine-based, not corona-based, and we can only prepare to this by, other than the former government, not ignoring the problem, but saying we need clinics, we need hospitals that are specialized on these consequences of the vaccination, which seem to be intended, as to my perception so far. The companies want to keep work safe as possible, but now, if they send their people to the so-called vaccination, then I think they have to know that the damage caused by this have to be compensated by their contributions to the health, to the work, occupational safety insurances, and that is only relative to the employer who forces them. Of course, those who don't do it are on the good side, but this is a feedback loop that we really need. This is something we have to know. Will they want to do everything to do that so that only by a political decision the license becomes void. So they are working for this. Yes, I've seen this. The Americans are discussing this now without public hearings, simply to provide the final licensing. That is another reason for us to say we really have to detach from the supranational institutions, take our own regime, and in cooperation with the other national states, in exchange, understand and decide what is right and what is wrong. It can't be the case that any new supranational bodies tell us what we should do or what not. Mr. Chancellor, we can do this immediately. We can stop this immediately in Germany, yes. Due to an existing danger, and that is something we can do. I think it's also going to be important that we create a hotline for people who, after vaccination, see adverse effects now and are not sure whether it could be anonymous, that people undercover want to get informed because they may be afraid and to speak up and speak out, or as with the doctor doesn't listen to them, or the doctor doesn't want to hear. So we need a hotline where people can contact people, and we need a campaign to inform about possible damages caused by vaccination. Many people may say it was the right thing to do, or I did it because I was pressurized. I'm going to meet with the medical chambers and the state governments. We have to develop a training for the damage recognition of vaccinations, qualifying doctors to really detect real vaccination damages and to develop issues on how to protect people and what to do about it. This is something that these bodies need to organize. That can be done quite quickly. We just need to find savvy doctors, and there are quite a few. We take care that doctors are trained, who can do this and probably would do this. Of course, it has to be paid for, obviously, but this is something that we have to take care of with the different states. And the doctors can be sensitized for things that they prescribe, that there may be adverse effects, and they have to be watched more systematically so that we can find these earlier and do not depend on the research studies which are paid for by the companies and who can decide whether they are published or not. Imagine Virx, where thousands of people die, although the company had the data, it was just not published.
So do we have to go back at the end of the day to something original healing methods that have been denigrated?
I think it's very good how the Scandinavians take the approach. They take the full range of possibility. There's budgets for the different regions, and that is related to the number of inhabitants, and that is spent by common decisions for the people who are responsible for the health system regionally, who say we have to be able to afford expensive medicaments, and they have to have physiotherapists, and that can be done regionally. And the national government only looks for transparency and exchange of information. I think that's a very sensible system. We don't have to do the same thing all over Germany. Why can't Baden-Württemberg have a different region who just has natural doctors, and 𝗵𝗺𝗂𝗹 says, no, we want to keep our chemical industry up, and we do the pills. So let's see where diabetics do better and where people feel better. I think regional responsibility with transparency will help us to learn, and we can follow best practices. And another big topic is patent right, but I think that is something we need to exclude today. However, that has a great effect. The fact that the whole industry take took care that their so-called vaccines are brought to the population here with contractual protection and exclusion of natural remedies shows me that we have to have a close look here and that we cannot simply rely on what the industry tells us, which is, from my point of view, much too close to the old government. This is something that can't go by uncriticized. Can we do the regions, establish the hospitals there and make them accountable for regional supply?
Mr. Chancellor, let's not put it this way. Can we build that for the regions? No, the regions should decide for themselves how much they need. And it's very easy to do. And this model that I gave you from Scandinavia, where they have budgets, where every region has to think about how do we spend our money, what do we spend it for, leads to a situation where these regions have a great interest in preventing people from going to hospitals, that they have a lot of preventive medicine because that saves a lot of money. And then you need fewer hospitals. So that's a subsidiary, a place where subsidiarity comes into play better than anywhere else nearly. And so the region should have a budget and then make transparent what they do with it and make it be responsible vis-a-vis their populations. And those governments, regional governments that do well will be re-elected. Those who don't will not be re-elected. If we start trying to control this from the federal level, then it will be as bad as what the old government did.
And as we are at the point where it seems to be important to me that this health and illness issue is not just looked at the physical level for the future, please bear in mind that the majority, as my experience from my practical profession tells me, many of the illnesses are a consequence of wrong and people living in relationships that they cannot free themselves from. So a future health system urgently needs the psychological aspects and the relation to the way where people live, what the relations people are in. My experience is that the biggest risk of illness is in living in destructive relationships, and that needs to be made aware to the populations. Currently it's a taboo. It's better to take some external cause for an illness and rather than to look at the toxic relationships I live in and the question on how I can change these. Let me just give you an example. I worked with someone who had the diagnosis COVID and is extending, and then I worked with him and found out what the background of their childhood was, what their trauma was. And after the work, she was much better. So immediately, so this is something that it's not the drugs, it's not the medication, and it's not natural remedies, but in many cases it's that the people are freed from their internal prison. They're in a split that we offer them an exit strategy so that they can activate their psychological self-healing powers, which have a strong effect on the physical health.
It's important to have a information campaign for the population that now that they're all living in fear, to make sure that the stress doesn't overwhelm them and make them ill again.
And this is why we should now set ourselves up to have this fourth wave in a different way and in a positive way, join up by regionally building up things together, create structures. What we're hearing here now, if that turns up, whatever we call it, we can't stop it anymore because the vaccination has been done, but we can set up a system together and in a positive way find solutions that protect us from conditions so that we can keep the system up and running.
We have to help each other out And if we start a campaign in that sense, and I'd be very grateful if, Mr. President, you could be the sponsor for such a campaign, because it's not identical for everybody. There are people who are lonely. Some people have very close social restrictions and they can't break out of them. There are people in the countryside, in the cities, and the potential support structures are different from region to region. But to accept that this is an issue and to say, let's talk about it, how can we accept that this is an issue and to say, let's talk about it, how can we make our lives easier that way? Those are things that we tend to suppress, and this is something that we need to deal with, and we can learn from each other. So I'd appreciate it if you could be the sponsor.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. If I look at new situations psychologically that we're going to face, I think this is an important development that we have to pick up on.
This is a clear and present danger. So let's say what in the health system, that in the health system we do something what pharmacies would normally do, that we issue a red letter to report about the things that we heard about the Justice Minister today. As soon as this is widely known, I'd say that the vaccinations will stop.
That we declare, by declaration or whatever, that these tests must not be used any longer for diagnostic purposes. I think this is something that we have to take immediate action on. Yesterday I read on the website of the Robert Koch Institute, the vaccination is harmless and good and effective. That is something that I will take immediate care of and make sure that this is taken offline.
Well, many staff members in your institution will be happy not to have to go along with this nonsense anymore as well. And we have to make sure that the federal government as a whole, not only in my own institution, but also all the other ministries that have spent a lot of money for campaigns, they have to be recalled as well.
We know from what we've heard today that an immediate stop of the PCR tests and the vaccination is required. Both of them are inadequate, don't help, and cost a lot of money. We can see that they are hazardous, not how, but that. And we see with the Corona pandemic, it's a PCR pandemic, which seems to be a psychological operation in the start, which was then transported with the vehicle of the mainstream media.
So we have to prepare for worse situation unfolding in the fall, not because of Corona, but because of the vaccinations. And at the end of the day, we will have to hold those responsible who are responsible for this. This must not be overlooked. This time the population has to see that individuals, or maybe numerous individuals, are responsible for will be held liable.
And I think we have to make sure and point out that due to the Drugs Advertising Act, there is prohibited activities. I can't sell sausages together with vaccination.
What we definitely need to do, I'm against punishable offenses, against bans, because the population has been manipulated for a year and a half. So against this background, I'm against punishable or punishing people for certain actions, but people who cannot protect themselves, children and elderly, there we should create punishable offenses.
I think it has to be taken off the market, and we cannot leave that up to the individual, because if we assume that another 100,000 people get vaccinated and they create problems because they get sick, that can't be the case. And I think the doctor chambers will have to be informed.
In every single case, we're talking about severe bodily harm here, because first of all, we have a violation of the Medication Advertising Act, so they're advertising it, and the information that the manufacturers give themselves, i.e., we don't know whether it's efficacious. We also don't know whether it's harmful, but we want to be exempt from any liability. And that is what people need to know about, at least vis-a-vis children and elderly people will be held liable immediately.
That can be done by the doctor's law, because doctors are the only ones who are allowed to vaccinate. So informing them and showing them the consequences, they will stop vaccinating, because if a not indicated vaccination is done, that is a simple bodily injury. That's quite a clear system here.
Only a consent after information is consent. However, no individual patient has been properly informed, and therefore nobody could give their valid consent. And so we're talking of personal injury with lethal consequences. That is a severe crime, not only for the companies, but also individuals.
And we need to have a different framework, legal framework for whistleblowing, because things that unveil actions harmful to the population, and the regulation also has to take care that this is not abused in itself.
The entire institution is on the wrong track, and the Works Council there has an important role to play. And I think, at least for the midterm, we should consider how we can install such a protection for people with the help of the Works Councils, so that the Workers' Councils say we won't collaborate with that sort of thing anymore, so that people won't be punished for whistleblowing.
And we have followed the mainstream ideas, and now something bad may happen if we over-dramatize this. I think it may return like a boomerang and lead to another worst-case situation.
And that also means that we need to be careful that we don't contribute to a social rift here, societal rift, that we don't contribute to this split running through our society. So we want to heal this gap, and I think that the people who have been vaccinated and who haven't been vaccinated should support each other. And I think that the society has been split already, and to bring this back together by making sure that people do things together. You can be wrong, you can make a mistake, some people are lucky, others are less lucky, and looking forward, it's important that we help each other. It shouldn't be preempted by polarization.
Vaccinated and non-vaccinated people, so that both parts can see the real enemy, who is the one who created the split up of society. And these are the people who, in lockstep with the industry that makes most money out of this.
The moment we can give people some hope that there might be treatments for any complications that may develop, ways that we can help people, and that might be helpful already, and with many other things. The faster they recognize it because they have a headache and they don't go around for 10 days before they're ready for a stroke already, or the thrombotic situation has already developed. If they go to the doctor immediately, and if they notice that if they see a doctor soon, think they can help me. So we have to tell people, face the brutal fact, that's the way it is, and we need to support them by offering ways out of the situation. But we have to make sure that we don't mothball people. We have to call on them to open their eyes. That's very important. We have to look at the psychological aspects of this, and I think that is something we should keep in our minds, that education is necessary. Well, I think that everything we are thinking now, our expectations, our assumptions, we have no data, but we fear only that this is coming. That doesn't mean that everybody who received a vaccination will have to bear these consequences.
I always thought it was important that those who want to get vaccinated, I asked them to get the dedimers tested 7 days afterwards, because then you will know whether you have higher blood clotting problems or not. Because if you don't, you can sit back and relax until nothing else happens, hopefully.